Yeah, I know for me with COVID, I mean, I started this position April 1st of last year. So the ability to interact in this Zoom world has been instrumental in terms of how I've connected. I had the good fortune of being able to meet with Siri. She, masked herself up and came over and we had a conversation. That was like the first time we met. But other than that, if I didn't have this ability to connect through the internet, then I would be way behind in terms of trying to figure things out. And I still feel I'm way behind, but yeah, our meeting is going to be starting up here. Our program about a minute out from 6 o'clock. We're live on Facebook and live here in Zoom. We have one of the lesser costly Zooms, so we're doing this in a meeting format. Some of you may be more familiar with the webinar side of it, but this is also pretty cool because it's trying to make up for the fact that we can't all be together in one space, but we can interact in this internet world in one space at least. Kind of like the Brady Bunch, looking at all the images across the screen. 6 o'clock. So you want to kick it off, Sterling?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. We're just going to let some more people log on, but I'd like to welcome everyone to leave any comments in the Zoom chat, in the Facebook comments, or email us at programs@albemarlehistory.org. Send us any questions you would like us to try to address during the show, and you can send us any suggestions you might have for future shows or guests. All right, let me make a few announcements before we get started. Our next special online series, Ask a Genealogist, will be May 11th at 7 p.m., focused on military records. Join Dr. Shelley Murphy and Miranda Burnett for this program. Our next speaker series event will be on May 19th at 7 p.m. And we will have Professor Irvin Jordan presenting Crimson and Black, a documentary sampler of historic Jefferson School, 1860s to 2000s. Professor Jordan will discuss a selection of published and unpublished materials from the holdings of UVA's Albert Shirley Small Special Collections Library on the history of Charlottesville's all-Black Jefferson School. Irvin L. Jordan Jr. is an associate professor of research, professor and research archivist at UVA, specializing in Civil War and African American history. He is the author of 3 books and has contributed to a variety of academic and general publications. Professor Jordan serves on various state boards and commissions and has done so for 6 consecutive Virginia governors. Several of his lectures and presentations are available on C-SPAN and YouTube. We're also trying to figure out what we're going to do for our next unregulated historical meandering. So if anyone has any suggestions out there, please let us know. But enough with the announcements. Let's make some history. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Sterling Howell. I'm here with Tom Chapman of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. And we'd like to welcome you to Unregulated Historical Meanderings, the Equity and Inclusion Edition. This is our 6th unregulated, unstructured live show in which we invite some person or persons to join us and have a casual conversation about things of interest to our friends here in Charlottesville, Albemarle area, and beyond. Today, we are proud to have Albemarle County's Director of Equity and Inclusion, Syria Russell, and Albemarle County Board of Supervisor Member Ann Mallek here with us to discuss the importance of local history to county governance. Syria Russell is the inaugural director of the Office of Equity and Inclusion of Albemarle County, where she oversees the Community Remembrance Project, commemoration of historic resources, and urban revitalization programs. Syria has been with Albemarle County since 2014, has served on boards of several local nonprofits, and as a lecturer at UVA. Syria was honored in 2020 as the Above and Beyond Local Government Employee by the United Way of Greater Charlottesville. Syria holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's in community and economic development. Ann Mallek is the Albemarle County Board of Supervisor member representing the Whitehall District. She was first elected to the Board of Supervisors in 2008, has 8 committee assignments, including member of the Charlottesville-Albemarle Convention and Visitors Bureau Executive Committee and the board liaison for the Historic Preservation Committee, and is a member of numerous local, state, and national organizations. Professionally, Ann is an educator and program coordinator for the Virginia Museum of Natural History and owner-operator of Currituck Farm Grass-Fed Beef of Earlysville. Ann grew up in Albemarle County, graduated from Albemarle High School, and earned a BA in zoology from Connecticut College. Thank you both very much for joining us today, Ann and Siri. And with that, Tom, please take it away.
Definitely. Thank you very much. When I realized I was muted, I just thought about it earlier. I've been in Zoom sessions all day, so I thought, you know, in the modern lexicon, the idea of you're muted, somebody saying you're muted, you're muted. You know, prior to a year ago, somebody would have told you that, you would have been, I don't know what you're talking about, but I think most people probably understand in this Zoom world now.
Yes, indeed.
Beautiful day. Thank you for the participants that are joining us on a wonderful spring day like this. I want to thank Ann and Siri for coming on and talking with us. And I guess we'll start out with the understand the mission. So the mission of the county's Office of Equity and Inclusion. Start off with a simple question. What is it? What do you do?
Sure. I think that the mission for the Office of Equity and Inclusion is really the alignment of our organizational mission. And so for those of you who don't know the mission of Albemarle County, it's really about enhancing the well-being and quality of life of all of our community members. And when we started the Office of Equity and Inclusion, it was really with that emphasis on the all, right? That in order for us to really well serve all of our community members, it would really require us to have an emphasis on equity and inclusion and to really start to center that as a part of our work practice. We're in the beginning, right, of our journey. You mentioned I'm the inaugural director. We've had this office since 2018. So like many local governments, because, you know, less than 1 in 10 nationally have an office like this, we're, you know, in the first parts of our journey here.
So from the perspective of the Board of...
Ann wants to say something.
Yeah.
I was just going to add a little bit about how challenging it is and how I've found over decades to gather stories. For many years, I've had a personal interest, and so have others, in unearthing and sharing the history of our many varied communities we have around the county. Many were centered around a parish church or a school. And in 2003, when I was teaching elementary computer, I carried out a history project with my elementary students in which they each wrote a letter to a living early student at the school, many of whom were in their 80s and 90s, and asked them what it was like at the school back then. We got hundreds of letters in return, which was not expected, but the people who were corresponded with were so thrilled to be asked. And the children who received a letter, often pages of handwritten documentation about sleeping out under the stars and other wonderful things that they couldn't imagine doing at school, they were thrilled as well. So I thought, well, this is great. We'll take this to the community level. But I have not been successful at trying to get oral history projects to get going in the northwestern part of the county where I'm most frequently hanging out. But fortunately, we have some really wonderful interviewers, Phil James and Mary Lyons, particularly in the western part of the county, who have had great success gathering information. And so I'm just trying to support building on all of this storytelling, because there's so much we need to learn from each other and where we've been. And so I'm really thrilled with this idea. And it's certainly far more successful than the original thought, which was a great big notebook to which everyone would send in their stories, which then turned into a great big server where everybody could put their digital things. But this is really going to be far better in the long run. And I thank Siri for helping us get it going.
So in terms of the focus is really on local history, trying to better understand it, trying to educate, not only teach, but also educate about, what has been the focus of local history, what is the narrative, and how that narrative may have excluded certain members of the community.
Yeah, and I don't mind saying a few, and if you want to pop in here, this is a project of the board, and so I think Ann's thoughts here are going to be really important. I would only sort of put forward that the board's community remembrance project is really about not just educating, but about also supporting inclusive storytelling and sharing of history. And so, sort of starting with, you shared some bios, I am not a historian, right? That is not my expertise. And I'll be, I'm always the first person to say that. So I think our work so far has really been in supporting community storytellers and in supporting and really following also the lead of so many of our community members who have really been doing work for years, right? And longer, to Ann's earlier point, to share community histories. And so our work is really about supporting those stories and helping to uplift and elevate the voices of the folks who are telling them.
If anyone has a chance after we get open again to come to visit the gallery on the first floor of the county office building, there are pictures of so many of the places about which everyone has a group of stories, a group of people who supported it, took care of it. And it's just sort of the opening window to what we hope to do.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you mentioned the Community Remembrance Project. So I was looking on the website. It's the Albemarle County Community Remembrance Project is a Board of Supervisors initiative to support the sharing of Albemarle County history. It is specifically intended to broaden the scope of our publicly told histories, be more inclusive of our complete community. I guess there's maybe an implication there that maybe those histories were not inclusive prior, or now we're trying to make more of a concerted effort on a government, county, community level to really acknowledge that and see, there's a step there in terms of that it's improving. It's improving how we govern. It's improving how we understand our history so that we can use that to better make decisions, move forward in an equitable way.
I think it makes us stronger in every way as a community if we have more knowledge of all the different neighborhoods and the people who live there, and also encourage those people and their descendants to participate more, to share those stories with us, to find their voice for county decisions. But there are certainly many stories that are known amongst the groups. It's getting people to make the connection to us and be able to share them. That has not happened during my lifetime here. And that's what I look forward to happening.
Yeah, and to sort of respond to your part, Tom, about sort of what stories have been told previously, right? I think the point you're making, right, that the stories often of women and of Black or Indigenous, other people of color in this community have often been less visible and less a part of the shared community history. And so, yes, right, this Community Remembrance Project then, and you hearing us talking about sharing a more inclusive history is meant to respond to that. When I first entered this role, one of the first things that I did that was particularly impactful when you're talking about community remembrance was actually, I took a ride with Naya Bates, who, had previously been the director of the Getting Word Project out at Monticello, and is just, obviously a tremendous community historian. And she drove me around Albemarle County, and really just gave me a lesson in how the sort of landscape of slavery had had carved out parts of our community. And it was incredibly impactful for me, as someone who's not native here, especially, to understand our landscape better in that way, right? And on that same route, she showed me, churches that had been built that were, historically Black churches, or churches that had been founded by communities of formerly enslaved persons, and churches that have been built by free people. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, right? Those are the sorts of some of those are the stories that we're trying to elevate. But we've also had community members tell us stories about a woman. This was a relatively recent story for me, at least, about a woman. I might mess this up. Her name's like Mary Bird Mcallister, who I believe was in the northwestern part of the county.
That's right.
And maybe you know that story.
Well, all I know is the Bob Dylan connection, but she was a musician from childhood and lived in the mountains in Whitehall. Yeah.
Right. Which, so that's a story that, I know that our Historic Preservation Committee has captured and is looking to, some people on here might know that story, who are, the story that we're looking to potentially elevate, or the work that we have recently been doing in partnership with the Monokan Tribal Nation, and really trying to do the work of both elevating and supporting that. Well, we can talk about that too. But to your point about what we saw when we first got in here, one of the things that we did initially, and that the board really moved on quickly, was our historic markers. When we did sort of an audit of our historic markers, we found that we were aligned with the rest of the state, in that we had a very low percentage of historic highway markers that were about women or a person of color. And the board sort of immediately went to let's expand what we have. And that's been a charge that we've been working on here most recently. And that's still, right, working with community. A very strong group of community members really led us through establishing a marker in recognition of the Albemarle Training School, which has been installed now at the former site. As well as, I know our Historic Preservation Committee, and Liz is on here, so she might want to talk about this, also working with community members to get a marker for Virginia Murray. So that's the sort of work, I think, that comes along with this.
I was interested, well, you mentioned, your background, your academic background is sociology, but at the same time, in terms of your tour that you took with Naya.
Though you mentioned that, to be clear. I didn't mention my education background, Tom, just to be clear, you mentioned that.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it in reference to, like, I'm not a historian.
Right.
Put into this to try to help understand things. But I think, though, from your background, it maybe is helpful, because maybe where Naya can show you the landscape, the historical landscape, that also very much shapes, has an impact on the society, on economics. And I'm thinking very, specifically about the project, Mapping Seaville project that Jordy Yeager has been working on, where there's a defined systemic activity that has occurred in the past that is still impacting how we look at things now in the present.
And I would note there's also a Mapping Albemarle, Tom.
True, yeah, and they're
Right.
expanding on that too, definitely. I saw his recent post indicating that they're going to be coming out with that pretty soon, so I'm very interested in seeing it. But yeah, I think that gives you an perspective on it, though.
Absolutely. And I'll make some space there in case you had a thought you wanted to share.
No, I'm all set right now, but thank you.
Well, I do want to come back, let's see, so the Community Remembrance Project. I know from the Equal Justice Initiative and the work that the Legacy Museum's done down in Montgomery, Alabama, they maybe laid out a roadmap for communities to follow, like looking at markers, looking at traveling soil exhibits, or I think there was a group of folks with the Henry James marker that when that was put up and the study was done to understand the location of that place on the railroad out near Farmville, Farmington, that a group of people went down to Montgomery with that soil added to their collection. But then that also, they're interested in having the community expand on that. So with the marker program, you know, where do you see that going? What makes it different than what maybe Virginia does with the Department of Historic Resources? Why does a community or a county need type of focus?
I think one of the distinctions that our local program, local markers, would not necessarily have to have statewide significance, which is what's needed to qualify for a marker under the DHR program. So we can choose to develop our own that tell an element of our personal story, our county story that we want others to know, and have much more flexibility to do that. And talking about that soil gathering event out there at Farmington on 250 West, it was a really powerful day because we were making a connection to the people and the event that happened so many years ago. And many residents, including myself, and I was born here, had no awareness. I mean, I don't know what the decisions were to not teach children in the 60s in high school in Albemarle County about these events. Because looking back, I feel as if I've been robbed and I really should have been taught this. But someone else made a decision. And unfortunately, my parents moved here in 1942, so they were unaware themselves and so weren't able to do that for us. But it was, I think, the beginning of a long journey, and certainly the impact of the families and the people who went on the bus journey, the learning that they did and what they brought back, the traveling to the soil traveling and the storytelling to all of our libraries were also very impactful because many, many residents came just to see it or saw it when they were at the library. Our libraries are very popular and have lots of foot traffic through there. So that was a great opportunity to be able to get this information out there.
Yeah, and to Ann's point about, about the history and, being taught that history, I'd note, you look at some of our sort of local leaders in sharing some of that history, the Historical Society, and also groups like the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, where the county has been providing support for some of the programs that they offer there that are specifically geared around providing local history to our educators. And in fact, we had recently a group of about 150 county staff that went through a racial equity curriculum that took about 10 months, but that featured a really hefty portion of local community history, where we actually were really quite privileged to have had the African American Heritage Center supplying their expanding our narrative curriculum, which is geared around local histories in particular, and then also really benefited from having representatives of the Monokan tribal nation also come and share some of their stories. And so from the staff perspective, I think to your earlier point, there's a lot that's wrapped up into history. One is, having a sense of place, right? Like, who are we and what do we mean in this space? And how have we contributed to it? We also screened Lorenzo Dickerson's really informative and I think impactful film on, on Albemarle's Black classrooms. And, seeing the county office building, right? And in that place, in that film, framed, not as, I like to think of it as, a place to go and get help, but framed there for community members as, a barrier to accessing services, right? Distinctly unhelpful, that's important for us to sort of have as as really stewards of the community, of folks who are really trying to live that mission of enhancing well-being and quality of life for our community members. We have to also understand the community history and the community and how they see us, so that we can be responding to that in ways that are intentional. And we know that there's deep memory in communities, and and us connecting with that and sort of growing our own awareness of that deep memory, and also how distinct. Ann talks about the project inside the county office building about, Albemarle's villages and communities, and each one of those has a really distinct history and sense of place. And that's part of the community remembrance work. It's, really making those connections.
I'll jump in with a small story about the deep memory, which you just reminded me. In 2007, when I was going door to door in the way north of Sugar Hollow, and stepped up on the porch of an African-American family and knocked on the door, and was wearing a little identifier to say who I was. And a very kind man came to the door and he said, well, the last time somebody running for was part of the government came to my front porch, or my great-grandmother's front porch, they burned the house down. He was in a family of African Americans who had been moved out of the land where the Shenandoah Park is now.
Okay.
A whole nother level of trauma that I didn't study in high school. But we have started to work on that as well, and have our chimney project out at Byram to help them to tell their story. But he said to me, I'll give you 5 minutes because I loved your dad. My father was a large animal veterinarian who traveled amongst all the households and farms in the county and beyond. Middle of the night, whatever, helping whatever animals needed help, and often was paid with a chicken and was happy to get it. And just, he loved people of all sorts, backgrounds. And so that was just a story that really resonated with me. And it's just one small example of, there are thousands of stories like that. And there were 120 families who participated in the chimney unveiling out at Byram, who were descendants of those families from the park. So each geography of the county has different stories to tell, and all different backgrounds involved in each one.
Yeah, that's one thing that, I was aware of living in Central Virginia and being around Albemarle County, Charlottesville for so many years. But as I've really immersed myself into that, the topography, as you mentioned, Matt, and from, the Blue Ridge side up around Crozet and there to James River floodplains, and like the Canal and the railroad, all the different groups. But then also coming back to what you've said, Siri, about the landscape and how that history was shaped, and the realization that maybe some of those stories and of very important communities still in existence in these areas have not been told. I don't know if I want to ask the question, but why has that happened? Is it just systemic in terms of racism? Is it economics? Is it just maybe blinders on, focusing on something else other than being inclusive and community minded? I don't know on the government side how that may work.
Well, I think, Ann, were you going to say something?
I would, if we had to put a word on it, rather than, I would put it as neglect, is that our ancestors, our predecessors were not open to the wider scope of input from people. And we didn't work hard enough. They didn't work hard enough to reach out to more voices. So the people who came to the meetings participated, and that was the basis on which decisions were made. And I think that in general, we're trying really hard to do that differently now. Siri, go for it.
Yeah, I think it's, I think I would struggle to put it on any one particular thing from my perspective. I think that it's a combination of a lot of factors. I think it's all of the things that you said. I think it's racism. I think it's, Ann talks about neglect. I think it's also part of the sort of, and I, like I said, I'm not a historian. I would be really interested in hearing what some of the people in the room think about this. But I think also in some of the areas in the county, which is over 700 square miles, it's quite large. You have also folks that are very like, what's this word, when folks are isolated, but also when things are internal. I can't think of what that's called.
Like
Insular.
maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Teamwork there. Thanks, everybody. I think that, and I also think there hasn't been as much interest in some, the platform hasn't always been there. Maybe that's part of the neglect piece that Ann talks about. Whereas in the city, I think there has maybe been a longer period of time, maybe the sort of like conversations about some of that started happening a little sooner. Maybe because, I don't know why, maybe because of size, or maybe because of, activities that were happening here. I think in the county, we've had sort of dominant history for a long time, right? Around, the presidential homes and, that sort of thing. And that there really was an intentional space made for some of the other things. And I see this where I'm going to walk that back. Sorry, y'all are going to hear me think out loud here, because I'm also like, well, but there are also lots of people who were doing community history work, right? We certainly didn't invent it, but maybe there weren't sort of larger platforms for those folks to be sharing their work broadly. So I don't know. I think it's a combination of things. I'd like to hear from some folks who have more expertise in that area. I don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
I would too, but also time, and the right time often never comes soon enough. But I do remember the furor when Leslie Bowman began to talk to her board at Monticello about telling the story of Mulberry Road. And it was not a simple decision. There were lots of people who said, oh no, we'll make everybody all upset. So she won that battle, and all the other homes have come along and done, I think, improving jobs every year. But telling the more complete story has been so appreciated by all the visitors of all races who come to those homes to see what's going on there.
Yeah, I would say, because I do feel like, I do just have to say out loud, I do think that, to Ann's point too, right, that for a long time, stories about women or histories that featured people of color and Black people in particular were not stories that folks thought were worth telling, right? So.
No, I think it's a common refrain in terms of looking at community history. Like, I love your story about your father, the veterinarian. There was those interpersonal connections. People knew people, and that in that insular little community that they lived in, there was a respect and there was an understanding. But get a little bit beyond that, maybe on a larger county level or even a regional, then you have other things at play. In terms of, would those same people outside of that community interact it with the same way because they didn't have that personal connection yet? Then it was other peers looking at you from a perspective of, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. But as our larger thought process about who we are as a nation changes, I see it very important that the local history sources are understood so that we can understand how we kind of move forward from that.
I also think one more thing, and this is just going to be serious thinking out loud here. So like I said, I'd love to hear other folks. But I had the opportunity a year or two to go to a conversation that featured like lots of different historians, and one thing that really stuck out to me at the time was the way there really seemed to be a divide between folks who were considered real historians, right, folks who were who had PhDs or degrees in history, the professionals, versus folks who were more community-based historians, right, who had studied and researched their communities, their families, or whatever. And I think that for a long time there hasn't been a lot of value placed on those community historians, right?
Right.
In the same sort of way. And so I think hopefully that part of what we're also seeing is an elevation of, own stories, own voices, and community members being able to tell community history.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I guess that'd be defined as like, academic versus public historian.
Yeah.
In the
Yes.
sense of, you mentioned the big homes, Jefferson's Monticello, and I, for all transparency's sake, I worked for many years at James Madison's Montpelier, so I definitely understand that mindset where, from a public history standpoint, we understand the property, but then you're a tourist site, and you have to have, people coming through the door and paying the tickets, and what do people want to see and what do people want to experience. But I think there's been definitely a groundswell and a complete 180 in many ways to say these are, plantations of enslavement. And the fact that our founders were able to do what they did was based on the labor of enslaved individuals, weren't even individuals, they were property. And that story has to be told, but it's always kind of been glossed over for many years. And now when you turn that around, it's like, oh, well, nobody's going to come. It's like, well, no, it fits into the larger narrative that we as a nation need to talk about. So let's see, where am I? I had a question, the traveling soil exhibit, is that still traveling, or with COVID, has it kind of been parked somewhere?
So, as you mentioned it, so the soil from the lynching site of Mr. John Henry James, there are actually two local containers, one of which is sort of on permanent exhibition at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And then the other, as you said, is, Albemarle County's traveling soil exhibit. That it made a full circuit through all of the libraries and in JMRL system, and also actually went to the Defense Intelligence Agency for the month of February in 2020. But you're right, once COVID hit and the libraries were no longer open for business, for people coming inside, it has stopped traveling, but we hope to be able to get that moving again soon as we start to come out of this.
I'd love it if you could put the Historical Society first on the list. I'd love to bring it back to the original Charlottesville Public Library, because that's one thing that you were mentioning with the county office building and how people perceived it. First thing that came to my mind is, as I've learned more about the building that the Historical Society is in, that we lease from the city, being the 100-year-old public library in the first 30-odd, 40-odd years of its history, was as a segregated space. And that community memory, that long memory that people have, it makes me think, and I don't know, heard anecdotally, but I don't know for certain that if some people look at the building I'm in and, connect me to it as the Historical Society because of their memories that have been passed down through their family about how they weren't allowed to access knowledge locally, and that has shaped how they remember things. So it'd be great. I'd love to have that here.
Yeah, I mean, don't just leave it to this though. It's like, send me an email or something.
Oh yeah.
I'll forget.
No, I know you were busy. I know you are constantly on the run. So definitely a reminder email there. For Monokan Remembrance, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I know let's see what's in the headlines, I guess, with Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea here in the city. There was a very strong input of Monokan discussion in regards to what to do with that monument. But in terms of the county-wide, how are there any programs, projects, things in the works to help understand or better have our community better understand that history?
You're actually giving us a great opportunity to plug our upcoming event. um, and So on May 14th at 3 o'clock, we'll be hosting a panel discussion on what is Indigenous history that will feature, actually, I see Professor Hampman is in here. They'll feature Professor Hampman as well as members of the Monokan Tribal Nation. And we're actually doing, in partnership with the Jefferson Madison Regional Library System, a community read. I don't know why I put that in air quotes. So a community read where we'll actually be reading the book on Monokan history that was actually written by, was co-authored by Karen Waters Woods and Diane Shields, two Monokan citizens. So I think it's a really good opportunity for folks to read, the history as written by the tribe, and then also to participate in in the panel discussion where like I said, we really benefit from their willingness to give of their time in that way, because I know they're really busy and this is a really busy time. So that is May 14th at 3 o'clock. And anyone who is interested can shoot us an email if you aren't already getting the county's emails. I would suggest that you sign up for that. And if you're interested, like I said, reach out, but also you can find that on our county Facebook and social media.
Right. Over the years, I've been fortunate enough to bump into Professor Hampman with my science campers in the summer. He sweetly invited us to come and look in the big holes down on Polo Grounds Road when he was excavating for Montezuma Canal way back then. And then again out at Morven. But at a recent presentation, I guess it was 2 years ago probably, Professor Hammond was describing a settlement at Lickenhole Basin in Crozet, which I never knew existed, and apparently had been the charred remains of the Native American settlement, had been protected in a way by a landslide of stone that came off the railroad in the 1850s. So I cannot wait to have more input from the Monokan representatives about how we can help to tell that story as well, because it's really important. We were not the first ones here, for sure.
Right. And to Ann's point, that hasn't been, that has not been one of the dominant narratives, in our sort of community history here. And I think that's been a sort of a point of focus for us to grow that relationship, because it's also a way of growing our own understanding, of the place that we live.
I jump in on, can I be heard? Hello?
Yeah, yep. You're here. Go ahead.
Good. So I thank you for the mention, Ann and Siri. And there is the event in May. And the county has also received a grant from the University Office of Diversity and Equity, Inclusivity, to reprint 500 copies of the book that Diane Shields and Karen Wood wrote. So this Indigenous history, their own perspective on their own history, which I think is hugely important. And I don't know where all those 500 copies are going, but they're going to go. And
they're going to be in the local, you can get them from your local library in the JMRL chain, and then also from the little free libraries in the county parks. Those will be out starting tomorrow.
So with Urtifa Binta Farid's help and many members of the Monokan Historic Preservation Group and Tribal Council, there's quite a bit happening right now. So it's more, the county has a pretty good record over the years since I first came. But every 5 years or so, something would happen and it didn't continue. Now I see things, there's a new generation now, thankfully, replacing me. And, and they are Monokan people telling their own story. And nothing makes me happier than that. And so you see that in that book. and in the panel discussion next week. That's as far, let me just refer back to little site out in Licking Hole Creek, now under the Licking Hole sedimentation pond. Federal law required a study of that place before it was disturbed. The university, my office, the archaeology lab always offered that as a public service. Graduate students were paid, I should say. I was the public service. But we did it. We studied that site between Crozet and Ivy on Licking Hole Creek. Very small. You couldn't open a museum there, or it would be, you'd be hard pressed to draw visitors. The point is, some of these very small places tell the story that's different than the narrative of disappearance, which is what I heard when I got here in the 1980s. Every presidential home I visited, every museum I visited. Well, by the time Peter Jefferson arrived, the native people had disappeared. Well, by the time Mr. Ambrose Madison first came, the native people had disappeared. And, you know, I'm carrying, you know, my PhD, and I'm talking to other PhDs. I said, how does that mystically happen? I don't get it. Just what does that mean? Why do you say these people disappeared? I just moved here from Arizona, where nobody would use that term. And just to wrap it up, the answer was, well, we don't have any written records. And that's not true. And people didn't disappear. They did disperse. And they dispersed to small hamlets out of the eyes, away from Monticello, away from Montpelier, away from the Rivanna, where they could live in smaller towns. And the site in Crozet, and I'll stop here, the site in Licking Hole Creek is one of those places. When we ran, the house burned down, we were able to do radiocarbon dating. It came back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, a century after Jamestown had been settled. And then you look at place names, Indian Fields, Indian Gardens, Indian Run. Those were not named, they didn't get those names out of nostalgic longing. These first settlers had known those places as Indian Fields and Indian Gardens, and they pushed those people away. They didn't disappear. And so that's the significance of this very small site between Crozet and Ivy is like that. And there are many more, and I'm working with Siri's staff, Urtifa and one of your GIS people, to map those sites so they won't be invisible. Thanks.
Thank you. And I so appreciate Dr. Hampman speaking up there, because it really is an illustration then of what the Community Remembrance Project work is all about.
Yeah. And I'll just throw in that at Corrine's Remembrance at University Chapel, the one phrase, if I could have memorized everything that was said, I would have been so happy, because it was unbelievably rich experience. But the one thing that was said over and over again is, we didn't go anywhere, we're still here. And changing that whole dynamic about they left somehow. It wasn't our fault because they went away. Well, no, they went underground for safety, or, you know, out of view, as Jeff said. But they're very clearly still here. And hopefully more and more of our neighbors will begin to tell their story of their ancestry that I'm not even aware of. That would be wonderful for enriching our whole experience.
Michael?
Well, I just had a question for both Ann and Siri. I'm 75 now, and I know I have a lot more stories than I did when I was 45 or 35. But, you know, time sort of sands the edge off your personality a little bit. You get more, I think, willing to take the time to listen to folks. So the question is, do you find as you're going around seeking these stories or talking to folks that it's easier to talk to old folks like me or young adults who have got a lot more at stake in the future than we do? I think that's sort of an important difference if you've recognized that there is any.
That's a good question, and I would start off by saying that that we don't describe them as old folks. We say more seasoned, right? So we have
Thank you.
more or less seasoned folks that we're talking with, and I would say that's interesting. I would say that in my experience, the more seasoned folks in our community are eager to share a lot of times. Especially if there's a sense that that it's going to be heard and that it's going to be recognized, especially for folks who who've sort of expressed feeling like they have not been recognized in the past. And I would say with our a younger or less seasoned folks, there's an eagerness to learn and to listen, right? And I think that I feel like I've seen in this community really exciting and energetic work from both. I've seen some of our more seasoned community members lead the charge out at Yancey, at the Yancey School Community Center in Southern Albemarle, where we've been really fortunate to be able to support them through the Community Remembrance Project, creating a history and heritage project that has been community led. And actually, when the building is open, I would invite folks to give it a look, because they've done phenomenal work to talk about the history of education in Southern Albemarle inside the entryway there. But then you've also seen younger folks like Jordy Yeager leading the charge as well, or Nia Bates, and many others. So so I don't know, I feel like both flavors have been offering a lot to this community, and we learn a lot from both.
I think for many young listeners, it's when they're lucky enough to realize that these stories may be lost if they don't listen carefully, that there's a lot more engagement that happens. And sometimes it takes a couple of decades of age to make that sink in. For those of us who grew up with many, many very, very elderly relatives living in close proximity. I mean, my grandmother was at 15 a sewer on the Ziegfeld train, because that was one thing that young single women were allowed to do in the teens, 19 teens, and escape from home under the watchful eye of a very strict chaperone. But there are just many, many different kinds of experiences that people, I hope, will listen carefully to their elders, their grandmothers, their aunts and uncles, while they can, because you never get that second chance. So I hope that people in general will take that chance, take that time.
And the Historical Society would definitely like to, you were mentioning an oral history project that never got off the ground earlier in our conversation. And we definitely want to focus on that with a few of our larger projects that we're doing. The focus for the past couple of decades has been the World War II generation, and as they passed, now we're getting into the civil rights generation. Folks through the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are now getting to a certain age where they're passing on, and trying to capture those stories and tell that history. And I wanted to, we're almost to the end here, and I just wanted to leave some time at the end for questions too. But I also wanted to bring up, we've been talking a lot about filling the gaps in the historical record, understanding the community and understanding more about local history, and adding to the information we have. But there's also a subtractive side of this, I guess, and I'm talking about the at-ready statue in front of the courthouse, where there's an important step being made on the community engagement level to remove something that is a barrier. Could you tell us a little bit about the process that the county went through to make that happen?
Sure. And probably not in 7 minutes, right? Because it was, an almost year-long process. But I think that what I would say briefly is that, county staff really worked hard to and really relied heavily on, our community partners. There was a lot of storytelling that was a part of that. And so there was really a focus on bringing as many voices to the table as we could to really expand, sort of our shared understanding of what do we really know about what's in this court square space and what does that mean to us as a community. So many partners participated in that process.
Yeah.
Was there a point in time, Ms. Mallek, in that process where your ideas of what that monument represented just completely changed, or did you always understand the history?
I did not understand the depth of enough of the story to begin with, for sure. I mean, this has been sort of over the last 20 years, but I'm fortunate in that I have many constituents in the Whitehall district who were not shy of telling me what they thought, and they were diametrically opposed to each other's opinions in many cases. Mm-hmm. But it was definitely a situation. There is no erasure of history here. It is removing a symbol from one place to another place where people can go and visit it if they choose. But to me, the most important thing was that the courthouse, the court square, had to be an emblem of neutrality, of equality, of sort of a place for peace where there is so much risk when you're in the court system, or when you're on any side in the court system is always a stressful time. And the last thing we need to be doing is increasing the risk and the misery that people feel based upon the iconography that was there. So I think it was very well handled from the legislative point of view and the public outreach and input point of view. We had lots of good discussion, and I was very pleased at the way that it was, I think, for government process, very swiftly carried out. We did not rush, but we also did not dawdle. And so I do not know if it is already reassembled over the Shenandoah battlefield or not. I have not inquired, but I think our court square is better off for its removal.
I think it was a very important decision, a very important community engagement, I thought, from coming into this position at the Historical Society, watching what the steps you went through. And I kind of we were talking earlier about trying to make connections in this COVID world, and all I can do is Zoom, but I sat in on the Zoom session for the Board of Supervisors meeting in August when you all made the decision. And it amazed me, and it was also, I was proud to hear to a person, I think, on the Board of Supervisors, everyone said, I didn't understand, I didn't know this. I didn't learn history. My family, my community, my teachers, I just didn't learn that. And by incorporating all of the community history and how people understood it, then that shaped, how you all thought, okay, this is a barrier. This is something, as you said, that is in front of a legal, county government, where you come for fairness and justice. For the larger part of the community who look at that, they don't see fairness and justice when that guy's in front of that place. So I think it's a very important thing.
Now that was, for me, that was the essential decider right there. And a little bit of extra story to go along with that is that the texts in Virginia studying history in the 1950s would make you cringe today. I mean, I have a copy that was in the storage cupboard at school that was about to be thrown out. And I thought, boy, I'm going to keep this for just a bad example of how never, ever to depict people in a community. Yellow and pink on the cover was all I remember. There was a series of them year after year. Why we were not taught a wider scope of history, I do not know. Were we too fragile to handle it in 1966? That we couldn't handle the truth as teenagers? I don't know. It's pretty demoralizing, frankly, to think that we were that pathetic. But I'm very glad that we're doing a better job now, and the use of original documents, the wider approach to that public history as told by people who aren't necessarily academics is really important recognition. So
Yeah,
I'm
and I
definitely a
think-
baby steps forward Pollyanna sort of person, and so we are making tiny steps of progress, and I have to hang on to that and keep that moving.
I appreciate that. And I think if you did look at the history of the same people who were instrumental in putting the monument up in front of the courthouse were also very instrumental in the writing of the history that the children learned for many years afterwards. So it's one kind of goes hand in hand, I think, in that regards, unfortunately.
Well, that's a connection I had not made until just now, so thank you. That's another horrifying thing to think of.
Yeah, and I'm a bookworm of sorts, and I've kept all the textbooks that I ever had in school. And I was looking at some of my older history, social studies books that I taught or learned from that are, entitled American Heritage. And probably
Uh-huh.
if they ever see this might get mad at me, but it was very much a narrative that was one-sided, and I didn't think of it then, and now I think of it now. But no, the other thing that was in my mind was you were talking about local history, and we had Ed Ayers on in January for a really cool presentation that he did, and he was telling a story about his mother, who was a teacher for many years. And when he went off to college and said, I'm going to study history, his teacher mother looked at him and said, well, why would you do that? We already know it. And referring to the textbook, referring to the big ideas, the big picture, the narrative has been told. And, Dr. Ayers, Professor Ayers looked at that and said, no, there's always more to learn. There's always more to understand. That's really been his focus and mantra that I'm trying to focus on here with the Historical Society is that we don't know it all. We need to go out and learn it and find it out. Well, we're getting on 7 on here. So Sterling, did we have any questions come in? I know I was appreciated Professor Hampman and Mike Dickens joining in on that, but any questions come in?
Nothing in the chat. If anyone out there would like to ask a question before we sign off, now's your time. No? All right.
I see somebody in Facebook, but I guess they're more worried about, I'm not sure what they're worried about.
I was going to let that one go.
Yeah, it looks like they're complaining about taxpayer dollars, and I'm not sure what that means because these might be public servants who we're talking with, but I know they're cutting into their dinner time, so I wouldn't even consider them on the clock at the moment.
Yeah, I would say it's about enough meandering for one evening at this point. But before we go, again, we always invite any suggestions you have about how we can meander from here. Send us your ideas for future guests, future topics, whatever ideas you have, please let us know. You can email me at programs@albemarlehistory.org. Don't forget to check out our next Ask a Genealogist on May the 11th. Also, if you'll check in the chat box, you can find the link to the May 14th community read book program on May 17th. Professor Jordan's presentation on Jefferson School. Don't miss that either, please. You can keep up with our calendar of events on our website and social media. And remember, everything we do as your historical society is because of your support. If you have not joined us as a member, please consider doing so. Our annual individual membership is $45. That's a very small amount that goes a long way towards supporting this program and all of our programs. And you have free access to all of our programs, our research facilities, and our annual scholarly magazine, which alone is worth the membership value. So please support your local historical society. Visit our website to join or call us at 434-296-1492. Unregulated Historical Meanderings is brought to you by the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society and our wonderful supporters like you. Thanks again, Siri. Thank you, Ann, for Zooming with us today. And thanks to everyone out there for joining us and supporting what we do. I'm here with Tom Chapman, and we hope to see you for our next Unregulated Historical Meanderings. Until then, meander on. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann, Siri. Greatly appreciated.
Thank y'all. Have a good night.
You're welcome and good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. Talk to you soon.